And we're good for time, so just so everyone knows, this is going to be, it's being live streamed, and then it'll be available on YouTube for viewing after we complete. Michelle, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This is our fourth working group session for the HART TOD pilot project. My name is Michelle Zender, and I'm a planner with HDR, and I'll be sort of the co-host of today's call. Go to the next slide. Agenda. So I'll walk us through our agenda for today. First, introduction from Nicole McCleary with HART, followed by Caitlin Johnson with SB Friedman is going to provide an overview of the affordable housing research we've conducted so far. And then I think, Steve, you're going to give a project overview after that. And then we'll talk about our workshop plans coming up next month. And then we'll close out with some next steps and contact information. Next slide. So I think we're all kind of becoming experts in this now, but as we're in our fourth call. But for those who aren't as familiar with WebEx, we just have a slide here to briefly call out some functions. There's a chat box in the lower right-hand corner. You can feel free to use that throughout the presentation. We'll be monitoring it. If you could put yourself on mute while others are speaking so we don't pick up a lot of the background noise, that would be great. If you have any trouble with the video during the portion, you can always call in. The meeting invite had call-in information. So you can listen to just the audio if you're having trouble. And also, you can email me. My email address is there, and I'll put it in the chat. And if you're having any trouble, I can help you as well. I think that covers it, and I will pass it to Nicole for a brief introduction of the project.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Nicole McCleary, Deputy Project Manager for the Transit-Oriented Development Pilot Project. The study team is comprised of HART, the project sponsor, the City of Tampa, Hillsborough County, Hillsborough MPO, and the Planning Commission. We have the working group, which is comprised of all of you. It's neighborhood organizations, major property owners, developers, and institutions that can be found within the study area. And then we have a fabulous consultant team that is headed up by HDR and includes SB Friedman, Plus Servia, Street Sense, and Playbook. Next slide, please. So just a little refresher about what the TOD working group is. So the purpose is really a sounding board for the project team. You guys are going to provide us with information. We'll provide you with information, and you will provide us with feedback as well. So this is a non-voting body. Our membership is open, and as I said previously, it is representatives from the neighborhoods, business associations, institutions, schools, medical and health professionals, all within the study corridor. So these are listed on our website. You will see everyone who is involved with the TOD working group. And then our meetings are planned for every other month, every 2 months throughout the study term. And it's led by HART and our consultant team. They do an excellent job. These meetings are listed on our website, and as I said previously, our working group is always open to other participants. We want to hear from you guys. We want to hear different ideas and opinions and views about where we're going with this project. Next slide, please. All right, so I guess I'll turn it over to Steve for a project briefing.
And Michelle, I snuck this before Caitlin, so I'm going to give you a very quick update on where we stand with the project. But the bulk of this is going to be focused on a report down of our research and findings and our next steps in developing recommendations related to affordable housing. So this is the HART TOD pilot project, where this is a study focused on land use development and mobility improvements within the communities along the plan routes for HART's arterial BRT project and the City of Tampa Streetcar Extension project. The goals are focused primarily on making or improving quality of life and livability in neighborhoods along the corridor, improving access to transit, and that involves improving walkability, improving safety along the local street networks, ensuring context-sensitive buildings and public spaces, and ultimately improving access to transit, which improves access to local and regional destinations. So it's a total 18-month effort for the planning work. We are currently in the process of developing our policy and strategy recommendations. So these would be the recommendations that would influence comprehensive plan policy, goals and policies, land development code recommendations, recommendations for public actions to promote affordability, and looking at mobility and transit access improvements in the stationary locations along the project corridor. We have this working group that's been in place since early in the study process. We meet with the study team, which is representatives from the partners at the City of Tampa, Hillsborough County, Planning Commission, and MPO, and obviously HART. And we're planning now for a public workshop to present the initial round of recommendations for the study, which would conclude our work under this phase 2 of the total process. And then we'll move into a slightly more detailed stationary planning exercise for the Palm Avenue stop, which is one of the locations where we've got overlap between the local bus network, the arterial BRT project, and Tampa Streetcar, the Tampa Streetcar extension. The two primary documents that are available for review on the website include the context assessment report, which is the more detailed document about existing conditions along the project corridor, and then our briefing book. And the briefing book summarizes that at a fairly high level and starts to set the stage for the recommendations that we're developing now. In terms of our approach to developing the planning and policy recommendations for the study, we're working through this sequence of activities from understanding the opportunities and challenges identified in the early phase of the study, looking at project feasibility. So we're doing both financial and design tests to see what kind of projects work in different locations, and looking at the implications of changing the rules a bit about how those projects are delivered. So looking at levels of affordability, about use mix, scale of project, and the overall density and intensity of the projects, and see what works from a market standpoint. We're using that as the basis for developing the TOD place types, and that sets the stage for recommendations about zoning and the guidance for the character of development to make sure we're achieving the goals for transit-oriented development, for walkability, for livability along the corridor. The strategies themselves, again, they influence comprehensive plan policies, the land development codes for the city and the county. We're looking at equitable TOD policies and strategies, and we'll talk a lot about affordability today, and starting to identify kind of critical capital investments to meet the goals for the project. So to get us to the real focus of this call today is around housing affordability. So Caitlin Johnson with SB Friedman we're gonna swap the screen share now with SB Friedman, and they're gonna share their slides, which provide a report on housing affordability. There's a lot to dive into in these slides. I have a very bad habit, and Caitlin will reinforce this, a very, very bad habit of interjecting and interrupting. So I will try to be quiet. I'll try to let Caitlin move through that presentation, and then we're going to spend the bulk of the time on this call fielding questions and having a discussion around what we've learned, what kind of path we might take to try to influence the pace of delivery of affordable, either protecting existing affordable or delivering new affordable units along the project corridor. Caitlin, do you guys want to pull yours up?
Is everyone able to see the new slides?
Looks good.
Great. Nice to be with you all again. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Caitlin Johnson with SB Friedman. I've also got my colleagues Elizabeth Ginsburg and Jeff Dickinson on, so we'll be happy to field questions at the end of the presentation. As Steve mentioned, today we are focusing on our affordable housing assessment. We know that lots of folks are active in thinking about, developing, planning for affordable housing in Hillsborough County and the City of Tampa. There's the Mayor's Task Force, ULI panels, affordable housing advisory panels. So this effort is not anticipated to duplicate those efforts. Our goal here is really to identify best practices and tools that are already being used and considered and understand their applicability in light of the proposed BRT. We do know that high-quality bus rapid transit can lead to changes in the nearby areas and attract new development of all types. This growth often does put pressure on neighborhoods, making them more desirable, but also contributing to displacement and exacerbating affordability challenges. So taking all of this into account, our affordable housing assessment examines the housing affordability near the proposed BRT line as it is today, and in the coming weeks we will be developing an affordable housing toolkit, which we will introduce. But today the focus is really giving a primer on some of the existing supply analyses, which will help inform that toolkit. So to begin, we wanted to first talk about housing affordability in regards to the concept of cost burden. Housing affordability is typically measured as a function of household income. A residential unit is considered affordable if no more than 30% of a household income goes towards housing costs. On the other hand, a household that spends more than 30% of its income on housing is considered to be cost burdened. This is a standard affordability metric defined by HUD, so we've used this threshold to evaluate the extent of cost burden for both owner-occupied and renter-occupied housing, which we'll walk through on the next few slides. In addition, we also want to discuss the concept of housing balance. This is the extent to which there's a mismatch between occupied housing units and the actual number of households in each income bracket. So for example, looking at this slide, an income bracket where occupied housing units, that's the bar that's shown in yellow, exceeds the actual households, which is the bar in red. This would indicate higher availability of units that may be occupied by households at other income levels. Vice versa, where the red bar, which shows the actual households, exceeds the yellow bar, which shows the occupied units, this indicates a shortage of supply available to that income range. For higher income brackets, this often means that households are occupying units below their means, but for lower income brackets, this would generally indicate a lack of affordable supply. On this slide, we're illustrating the housing balance for owner-occupied households specifically. Here we see that the supply of owner-occupied units generally exceeds the actual households at most income levels. So that is, the yellow bar is greater than the red bar. Higher income households appear to reside in units that would otherwise be affordable to lower income households, particularly at that highest income threshold where the red bar exceeds the yellow bar. Going to the next slide, we wanted to layer in additional information on the extent of cost burden, which is that dark red bar on the charts. What we see here is that despite generally having the supply of units for each income bracket, the majority of owner-occupied households at or below 80% of AMI, or those that are earning less than $50,000 per year, are cost burdened. And this, we believe, is due to the mismatch between the supply and higher income households living below their means. In particular, the most cost burdened households are those earning less than $20,000 and between $20,000 and $35,000 annually. Doing a similar analysis for renter-occupied housing, on this slide we are looking at the overall housing balance for renter-occupied housing. And this shows a little bit of a different story than owner-occupied, particularly for the renter households with incomes less than $20,000 per year, which really do suffer from the supply. Here we have pretty large mismatch between the units available at this income level compared to the number of households. Again, higher income households appear to reside in units that would otherwise be affordable to lower income households. Again, layering in the cost burden data, we find that there are over 100,000 renter-occupied households that are earning less than $50,000 that are cost burdened in the county. This includes nearly 90% of the households earning less than $20,000, and 85% of households earning between $20,000 and $34,000. We believe this is due in part to both the limited supply of housing units that are affordable to folks or households at this level, as well as higher income households living below their means. And this really points to a need for additional affordable housing units, particularly for very, very low income households earning less than 30% of the AMI, or area median income.
Hi, Caitlin. This is Milton with the city. There's a lot of information to digest. I was wondering if you could just maybe take one of the columns and sort of as an example to walk through, so there's the 75,000 range, and kind of as an example to help kind of tie the data to what we're seeing.
Yeah, of course. Let's look at the less than 20,000 threshold at the very bottom. The dark brown line is the occupied housing units. So this is essentially the supply of housing that would be affordable to renters at that income, earning $20,000 annually. The red bar, including the dark red and the light red, that is the total number of households at that income level. So in the dark bar is the cost burdened. So that's the percent of the households at that income level that are cost burdened. So with the red bar being greater than the brown bar in this case, that indicates more households earning $20,000 compared to the number of units that are available and affordable at that level. Of the folks, of the households earning less than $20,000, about 89%, so about 47,000 of those households indicated that they spend more than 30% of their income on housing costs, which means that they are cost burdened. Does that clarify?
Thank you.
Great. We can go on to the next slide, please, Elizabeth. The next component of our analysis was an affordable housing supply. So when planning for transit investment, it is important to consider how all residents could benefit from increased housing choices driven by improved transit access. Given the diversity of residents and the market conditions in the study area, we've structured our analysis by the 5 sub-areas that we've previously introduced. Understanding the existing supply of rental housing by sub-area helps inform us to who will be most impacted by the transit improvement, which in turn allows us to elevate and prioritize the needs of the current residents. And combined, this knowledge helps inform our local strategies and prioritize the public and private investment to help support equitable outcomes. So first, we're going to define what we mean by affordability in the context of the supply. Understanding the affordable housing market is important to understand and predict market pressures. So we need to first define it so that we are talking about the same things. So for instance here, when we're talking about affordable rental housing, we're typically referring to 2 types. The first is legally restricted affordable housing, and you'll see that denoted as LRA on our slides. This is housing that is contractually obligated to serve lower income households and populations. These units are often owned, operated, subsidized by various groups, including federal, state, local governments, and nonprofits. The different legally restricted housing programs do target different populations and income categories, but generally they target about 60% of the area median income. So that's the threshold that we've used in this assessment. Additionally, when we're talking about affordable housing, we do consider naturally occurring affordable housing, and we denote this throughout the presentation as NOAA. These are the privately owned market rate units with rents that are affordable to households earning less than 60% of AMI. Without contractual obligations, maintaining that affordability limit, as market conditions improve, landlords can choose to increase their rents to levels which may become unaffordable to the current residents, and this is a path towards displacement. The other affordability level that we consider in this assessment are higher rent housing, and these are just rental units that are affordable to households earning greater than 60% of AMI. The 60% AMI threshold is defined by HUD for the metro region, and it varies by the unit size and household size, and we've taken this into account in our assessment. So the chart on this slide breaks out the occupied rental units by affordability type, so the three levels that we had just talked about. Overall, there are about 64,000 affordable housing units in the county that are affordable to households earning less than 60% of AMI or less. This represents about 29% of all occupied rental units in the county. Of those affordable units, there are about 22,000 legally restricted units in the county. Within the study area, which is shown on that bottom bar, there are approximately 7,150 affordable units, or approximately 56%, or about half of the occupied units within the study area are affordable. There's a fairly even split between those that are legally restricted and those that are naturally occurring units within the study area. And over the next few slides, we're going to break down this data in a little bit more detail for each of the sub-areas along the corridor. But to start off, we're going to zoom out and look at the wider county. This slide shows the spatial distribution of the roughly 22,000 legally restricted units in the county, including projects that are built prior to 2010, and then the newer projects that are built since 2010. As shown in the dark purple, the newer legally restricted projects have primarily been concentrated in downtown Tampa, East Tampa, and Brandon. Looking at the study area specifically, about 18% of the units in the county are in the study area. But the study area did capture about 40% of the new units delivered in the last 10 years. Many of these units are associated with the Encore District, which is the Tampa Housing Authority's redevelopment project in downtown Tampa. Zooming into the sub-areas, legally restricted units are primarily concentrated in the three sub-areas: downtown, Tampa Heights, and then the Fowler USF sub-area. As mentioned just a minute ago, the Encore District accounts for about 75% of the new construction of legally restricted product in the study area, and it's about half of the downtown sub-area's supply. While much of the remaining product throughout the study area was built prior to 2010. Other larger legally restricted developments in the study area do include the Robles Park and Tampa Heights sub-area, and the Oaks Riverview and the Seminole Heights sub-area, and both of these are also Tampa Housing Authority projects. Legally restricted units are bound by contractual obligations to maintain long-term affordability. While these restrictions maintain the affordability for a specific set of time, eventually these restrictions expire. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of these units will lose affordability. Many legally restricted units are maintained by mission-driven organizations, nonprofits, or owners that would choose not to, that will choose to extend the legal requirements. But there are for-profit entities that may flip at-risk units to market rate once affordability requirements expire. The level of risk for legally restricted units could pose a long-term affordability issue for the study area. As you can see on this chart, we've looked at the risk for expiration over the next 20 years in 5-year increments, with the dark purple expiring in the next 5 years and gray indicating units that are not at risk for expiration within the next 20 years. Combined, over 70% of the legally restricted units in the study area are at risk to expire in the next 20 years. Of that, over 20% of the legally restricted units in the study area will be at risk in the next 5 years, and another 15% will be at risk between 2025 and 2029. Of particular note, all of the legally restricted units in the Seminole Heights, the North Florida, Nebraska, and the Fowler USF area are estimated to lose restrictions in the next 20 years, and roughly half of the supply in downtown and Tampa Heights are set to expire in 20 years. Now, looking at NOAA units, or the naturally occurring affordable units, overall, the study area contains about 2,300 NOAA units that are affordable to households earning less than 60% of AMI. Again, these are not units that are bound by any legal restrictions. The presence of NOAA is extremely limited in downtown Tampa, Tampa Heights, and the Seminole Heights sub-areas. And this is really driven by where the market conditions are stronger and folks, the housing prices are already increasing to levels that are unaffordable to folks earning less than 60% of AMI. The downtown sub-area, as indicated on the map, appears to have no NOAA units, while less than 5% of the occupied rental units in Tampa Heights and 20% of units in Seminole Heights are NOAA. On the other end of the spectrum, NOAA is more prevalent in the weaker market rate residential markets, including the northern sub-areas of North Florida, Nebraska, and then Fowler USF. Approximately...
Caitlin?
Yes.
I can't help it. I'm going to ask a question. This is Steve. For this definition for the NOAA rental units, what kind of properties does that include? Is it single family for rent, or is it just the products in attached housing?
It includes all units defined as being renter occupied in the census. So if it's a single family house that's being rented, that would be included in the database, but otherwise just older apartment projects that have lower rents would be included within that.
And we just as a,
go ahead.
I was going to say, just as a side note, we do have mapping that shows the kind of distribution of owner-occupied and rental-occupied housing throughout the study area. So that this basically aligns with that mapping.
Great. In regards to those two sub-areas on the end, just a few metrics related to the proportion of NOAA within those sub-areas. About 40% of the units in the North Florida, Nebraska are considered to be NOAA, while about 35% of the occupied units in the Fowler USF sub-areas are NOAA. An important metric that we've considered as part of our analysis is the risk for displacement. We've synthesized our research to get a sense of the overall risk by sub-area, taking into account various metrics that we've discussed here, as well as our general market research for residential uses. We've accounted for expiring legal restrictions, the presence of NOAA, and market rate market conditions, including the recent investment and increasing rents in each sub-area. The market rate residential conditions are a particularly important metric to consider because increasing rents that are anticipated to accelerate by the transit investment poses a particular risk for displacement for households living in the naturally occurring affordable housing that does not have the legal restrictions. So looking at the varying risk along the corridor, we do see that downtown and Tampa Heights have the highest risk for displacement in the near term. Both of these sub-areas have a high presence of legally restricted units with approximately half of the units at risk for expiration in the next 20 years. Additionally, both of these subs have limited presence of NOAA, strong market conditions with recent investment, and in the increasing prices appear to have already priced out NOAA units, and there's a risk of this continuing and putting more upward pressure on the units that are there. Seminole Heights and the North Florida, Nebraska sub-areas are at medium risk for displacement. Seminole Heights has a low supply of both legally restricted and NOAA units, but the strong home ownership rates help maintain neighborhood stability in the sub-area. But nevertheless, this sub-area will likely feel pressures of increasing rental rates in the future with BRT investment. The North Florida, Nebraska sub-area has fairly limited legally restricted units, all of which are set to expire in the next 5 years. However, this sub-area has a high proportion of NOAA, and a fairly limited market rate investment is occurring. So prices appear to be relatively stable within this sub-area. And then finally, at the north, we have the Fowler USF submarket, which appears to have less potential for displacement. This sub-area has a high supply of both legally restricted and NOAA units. While this area has experienced high rent growth, these rent levels are still comparatively low, making this an affordable sub-area to live. We do know that there is investment occurring at the University Mall. Much of this activity has been limited to the mall site itself and has not led to direct displacement of residents. It appears that most of the near-term market rate activity in the sub-area could be absorbed by this redevelopment project, so it appears that there's really less risk for the sub-area overall. So given the varying supply of both legally restricted NOAA units, the varying market conditions along the corridor, we see that the need for new construction and preservation varies throughout the study area. For example, in sub-areas with higher risk for displacement, it could be important to prioritize preservation strategies in those sub-areas. As we build out our affordable housing toolkit, we will take into account these varying conditions and ensure that tools are prioritized in the corresponding sub-areas. So as I mentioned, we are in the process of developing this affordable housing toolkit. Over the next few slides, we'll give a look at our current progress, the various tools that we're considering, what we've heard so far from the development community. So we have structured our toolkit into 5 primary categories, which you see on the screen here. Again, as a reminder, we're not trying to duplicate efforts that have already happened in the city or county, but really build on those existing efforts. So here we have 5 categories, including housing programs, which are the locally operated programs to help build or maintain affordable housing. You'll see on the slide there are some examples of housing programs, some of which are already being implemented in the city and the county. We are also considering regulatory options. These are the local regulations which protect affordability. Here we've listed 3 options, and these are really used to help support preservation of affordability. In the red, we have zoning tools, which are the land use recommendations to increase affordable units and protect existing units. This is one of the key areas for discussion related to TOD in regards to overlay districts and density bonuses and parking waivers. So we are thinking a lot about these particular tools and how they can apply throughout the corridor. And then, of course, there's funding mechanisms. These are the tools that establish funding sources for affordable housing. So housing trust funds, community redevelopment agencies or CRAs, community development finance institutions, and affordable housing bonds. And the final area that we're considering, or final category really, is capacity building. And these are the tools that will help garner support and partnerships for affordable housing. So while we are still working on building out this toolkit, the list that I just went through is our preliminary list that we're considering. But this slide introduces the concept of the toolkit dashboard, which will really be an organizing structure for our toolkit. We'll be organizing each of the tools that we presented on the previous slide into its primary tool category. So one of those 5 categories on the left there will indicate whether the tool could be used to support new construction, preservation, or both. We'll identify the entity that would be the primary implementation lead, as well as which sub-areas or context could be prioritized as part of the planning efforts. A key component of our understanding of how tools could be used to support affordable housing in the corridor is really interviews with folks. We've been having ongoing interviews with key informants. We've been talking to affordable housing developers, and in the coming weeks, we intend to have one-on-one and focus group interviews with public sector and nonprofit implementers. But this slide here helps to inform the effectiveness and desire for various tools from the development perspective. We wanted to understand what tools may be available to help overcome the barriers that they mentioned and help use this to inform the creation of our toolkit. In terms of housing programs, we've heard that the primary program that is used to support new construction is the low-income housing tax credits, or what's known as LIHTC. This is available from the federal sources, and developers are less reliant on local programs, is what we've heard. That being said, what we've heard is that the existing programs typically target households earning less than 60% of AMI. Only about 10 to 15% of projects getting delivered appear to be for the 30 to 40% AMI range. And this is primarily due to the significant funding gap, making it difficult to secure sufficient funding. Also, we've heard that there were limited programs available to support workforce housing or housing for households earning between 80 to 120% of AMI. In terms of the regulatory options, we've actually had fairly limited discussion so far with developers related to this. These tools, as I mentioned, are typically used for preservation to support home ownership. So in our discussions with developers, it did not come up in related to new construction. We also have spent significant amount of time talking about these zoning options. One of the key findings from these discussions is that zoning benefits such as density bonuses, parking waivers, or reductions really only do nibble at the edge of a project's financing gap. These tools can be used to turn the knob slightly, but are really not sufficient to spur development or close the financial gap. In terms of parking reductions specifically, we heard that in some circumstances, parking reductions are helpful, but they really do need to fit within the larger context. So, for example, projects catering to very low-income households where residents may not own cars and may require less parking, those waivers and reductions work there. But ultimately, parking provisions would align with what the market wants to deliver. Additionally, we've heard that securing variances can be difficult, but expedited permitting does not necessarily help close the gap. We've also heard that form-based codes help with uncertainty because developers could build by right without worrying about opposition from the projects. We've also spent a significant amount of time talking about the various funding mechanisms to help fund the gap for affordable housing. What we've heard is that the 9% LIHTC credit is oversubscribed in Florida. There's effectively one 9% deal annually, which alternates between the city of Tampa and the county. And there's a perception that projects that are already being championed or have received public financial support score higher in the QAP process, which is the process that's used to allocate tax credits. And therefore, those projects are more likely to receive funding. Effectively, what we've heard is this requires developers to have established relationships with the city and the county, which may exclude developers who are not already active in the region. Additionally, we heard that the recent stimulus bill which changed the 4% deal structure from a floating rate to a fixed rate, helps to make deals more viable. However, compared to the 9% deals, this does leave a larger gap that needs to be filled by other sources. And we heard that ideally there would be more local sources available to support affordable housing. Despite availability of that $10 million in HOPE funds used to fund the Hillsborough County Housing Trust Fund, we've heard that there are fairly limited local funding sources. We also did hear that a flexible funding source similar to the Penny for Pinellas funding could go a long way to support projects. And then finally, in terms of capacity building, we've heard that the university area CDC is present within the corridor. We've talked with Sarah. We've heard about all the great work that's being done there. But in general, the corridor is lacking local CDCs with sufficient capacity and the experience to champion projects across the board. And as I previously mentioned, it's increasingly important to leverage partnerships and relationships between those community organizations, the public entities, to really champion these projects. And again, we heard that this helps with scoring on the QAP process, and really it generally helps with creativity for funding deals. So as you can see, we've had really great feedback so far from the development community. It's helping to give us greater understanding to the challenges to producing new affordable units. And our next steps is really to continue these discussions. We'll be having one-on-one interviews and smaller focus group interviews with public sector and nonprofits that are implementing programs to support affordable housing. As Steve had previously mentioned, we're in the process of finalizing our financial modeling, and we're working through some of our financial tests to inform policies. And then ultimately, we're going to be building out this toolkit that we've been walking through to help understand how the various tools can be used to support affordable housing construction and preservation throughout the corridor. I know this was a lot of materials, tried to get through it as quickly as possible, but we're happy to answer questions and have a discussion. If you have names of folks we should be talking to, we're happy to add them to the list and just get general feedback from you all.
Yeah, what we'd like to do is we only have maybe 5-10 minutes to close out. So we have the remainder of our time on this call to focus on this discussion. So Elizabeth and Caitlin, why don't we keep your slides up in case we need to circle back, and then let's just open it up for comment or discussion. So does anyone want to kick us off? I think there is a lot to absorb, so I imagine it's taken a little bit for people to construct some questions. One of the things that we didn't talk too much about, Caitlin, was the question about the public strategies to try to influence the maintenance of the naturally occurring affordable housing, especially up to the north area. So we know we've got a lot of, there's like a 50-50 mix of owner-occupied and rental-occupied housing in the neighborhoods along Nebraska and north and south of Fowler. We didn't talk much yet about the kinds of programs that could help stabilize those neighborhoods without accelerating levels of gentrification or levels of investment, and while maintaining high levels of livability and allow those folks to benefit from access to transit. And that's really part of what this whole project's about.
Yeah, we are considering preservation tools within our toolkit. For example, revolving rehabilitation loans or grant funds are a powerful tool that can be used to support capital improvements for single-family homes. I believe the City of Tampa has a program, an owner-occupied rehab program, in which they provide funds and then have I believe it's a deed restriction associated with it to ensure affordability as the market improves. So we are considering preservation tools like that, down payment assistance that can help with neighborhood stability for single-family homes. So we are in the process of considering those.
We've got a couple hands up. Jay, I see your hand up on the
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Caitlin, that was a great presentation. One thing that you said in this presentation, I believe I've heard it before, is what I'm assuming to be middle-class folks and upper-middle-class folks who are living within their means or even saving money because they are in homes that would have been considered affordable to others, but they are making well above the AMI. Is that a positive, a negative, or is that just something indifferent and you guys grab it and it's an interesting talking point? Thank you.
Caitlin, you're on mute.
Sorry, I put myself on mute. That is something that we saw occurring in Hillsborough County. If we go up to the owner-occupied slide, for example, in that top bar, I believe the households are earning more than $75,000. You have nearly 150,000 households at that income level, but only 66,000 households. So presumably, those folks are living below their means and living in housing that would otherwise be occupied. This is fine to the extent that you're not displacing households from other income brackets. One thing that we always consider is if you increase the supply of housing at all income levels, hopefully you could attract people to live within their means by providing the right housing stock that's attractive to them. So that's one thing that we consider in providing a diverse housing supply in the future.
To Jay's point, this is Jeff Dickinson. Those 147, the spread there is, what is that, 80,000 housing units. Well, they're taking the spread on the 50 to 75, that's going to those folks. It sort of trickles down. And so it does constrain supply at all levels. I mean, is it a bad thing or a good thing? It's a thing for people who bought a house and never moved. I mean, I guess it's good. They're spending money on other things in Metro Tampa, but it does put pressure on the housing market, I guess, is Caitlin's main point that she's making, and that's right. I don't know that you can convince someone who makes $500,000 a year to buy a $1.5 million house or whatever, but and that's available in Tampa, obviously. So that there is a solution. The market will solve that problem, I guess. But the trickle down effect is that it does. It's not an uncommon thing for people to choose to live below the sort of HUD standards if they have this much income, and that just exacerbates the challenge.
So the follow-up to that, I'm sorry that I'm speaking out of turn here, Steve, but my follow-up to that would be if you drill down into that data, are a lot of those long-time homeowners who are enjoying a very depressed tax bill compared to their neighbors. And while there is a portability cap on your taxes, that might not be as stark a statistic in a state that does not have depressed real estate taxes for long-time homeowners. Could that be a thing, or am I just searching?
Probably not as bad as California, Jay. I think the California story is way worse. I don't know if we can know duration of ownership through census data. I'm not sure we've got that information. I'm not sure how you easily get that at all, actually. But your theory seems plausible-ish,
The other hands are up. Commissioner Overman.
Oh, I just wanted to two things. Say thank you very much for all this data. It's nice to see the updated version of a lot of it because we've seen some of this in the past, and the census numbers just came out, so it's interesting to see, what you're looking at and what we're seeing now. But I think to Jay's question is also, we have seen great stability in neighborhoods when people finally get where they want to go, and so while their income has gone up, their housing cost has not, relative to rents, and leaving less supply available for people at lower income. And also the barriers to entry are huge. They just are. But I think it's encouraging to hear some of the things that you spoke about, because I'm still trying to figure out how to get overlay zones or TOD zones in order to help spur on housing development. But also, remember, we did not get our appropriation for SHIP last year. They didn't sweep, but they also didn't appropriate. So the home improvement funds, in order to stabilize communities and make sure that people aren't actually having to come out of their home because they can't afford to fix their roof or do the improvements in order to stabilize the neighborhood, those dollars were not appropriated last year. And while we had some, we had very little as compared to what we really need. So, my job is to continue advocating for affordable housing dollars. But the key here, I think, also is we have to use all the tools. And I really appreciate the research that you've done here on what triggers we can utilize in various different areas. In this area, it's very, very specific. But we've lost downtown in Tampa Heights because we didn't have the zoning in place. And so I don't want to see the rest of, everything north on this corridor lost either. But that, unfortunately, is going to be a city call or a partnership with the county. So I hope that we make sure our electeds, all the way across the board, are aware of your findings as quickly as possible so that those areas could be possibly preserved with either overlay districts or zoning in order to facilitate additional affordable housing in those areas and to stabilize the housing that's there. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
We have two other hands up, Abby Feely and then Commissioner Kemp.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. I have a couple questions and a couple of reflections on the information that was provided this morning or this afternoon. You had mentioned that you'll be reaching out to the public sector and conducting some focus groups. When will that be happening? What's the timeline for that? I think you definitely need to come meet with our housing and community development team. I think that we have a lot to add to this effort. So that was one.
I guess to answer right away, we were thinking in the next month, we were hoping to get some interviews scheduled. We wanted to compile our full list of programs that we're considering and then vet those and hear about the effectiveness of the existing programs. So we're pretty close to wrapping up that preliminary list of programs, and we'll be reaching out to folks soon.
Okay. You mentioned the at-risk units. Those units, so a lot of times an affordability period that is linked with your LRA, that is a 30-year affordability period. Sometimes it doesn't allow for more than a 50-year affordability period. Those affordability periods have been challenged. So how is that weighing into the story kind of that you're presenting? I thought much of the information you presented about the different areas and what you found there wasn't actually reflected in your slides. I hope you recorded this so I can go back and hear, Caitlin, what you said when you went through what Seminole Heights, and then you presented 2 or 3 items related to Seminole Heights. You talked really fast. So I tried to take as many notes as I could, but I think much of your messaging and findings related to each of those zones may not have been as clearly represented in what transpired on the slides.
Is there a specific case you want to make? Maybe we can try to talk for a second about that. And then this is being recorded. It'll be available on YouTube, and we'll have a link on the website to it, so you can go back and filter through this. The slides will also be available.
Yeah, and we also have text in the executive summary and in the briefing book related to this.
Great. The last note I made was on profitability. I know a lot of what's coming, I was recently working on a project with 300 units where we were looking to get 10% of those units, so 30 of them to be affordable, and the response was, that breaks the deal. The developer can't do it. It will cost them $5 million just to give you 30 units. And I find, where is the breaking of the deal, the profitability that the developer is then not encountering by providing an affordable unit? When you had those discussions, what was that discussion and what is the gap that they're actually looking for? Because I think it all really comes down to the bottom line of what's going in their pocket after construction costs, and then for the actual long-term viability of managing those units that would then become LRA units, so to speak, within their market rate project.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this if that's all right, Caitlin. This is Jeff Dickinson again. The mixed income buildings are really tricky. We appreciate the benefits of them to a community, but if I can put on I'm not a developer, but my pretend developer hat, they have financing partners who don't want to deal with affordability. They have lenders who don't want to deal with affordability. They have potentially tenants who don't want to deal with affordable units. It's just, and so the shorthand, perhaps what they're saying to you is, it breaks the deal, but it may be a financial component, as you said, but it could be any of those things. It could be other things. But fundamentally, I think, in our experience generally, developers don't want to do a mixed income building unless they need something from the public sector. So if you've got land they want, if you've got entitlements they want, if you've got something, or need, really, not want, but need, they will contort themselves and their partners to do a mixed income building. But otherwise, they're just not going to do it. It's too much trouble, and it basically sub-optimizes their economics. And so, you have to have a carrot and a stick, or at least one of those two things, in order to shoehorn it. And it really only works economically, often in really high rent locations. So, we were speculating. We're not doing, a million types of analyses. That there might be enough economics in a really juicy site downtown, if it's city-owned land or whatever. You can squeeze some affordability out of those folks on a mixed income deal. And we see that in other parts of the country. But the further you get from tippy-top rents, the tougher and tougher it gets to basically curtail rent potential. I mean, a lot of these folks who buy these build these buildings, they want to flip in 3 years, and they want to sell it with a pro forma that has 3% rent escalations baked in. And as soon as you cap the rents on some percentage of it, you're just capping the profits. So I guess that's a long answer to basically agree with you, but it's a little more information around the edges.
That's well said. I agree, Jeff.
I appreciate that. Lastly, and thank you so much, Commissioner Kemp, for allowing me to jump in front of you on this and finish up. My last thought is on capturing existing units. I think when we have these discussions, we talk about the potential for new construction and bringing things online and what has to be right for those things to happen. Or you talk about preserving what's already in the inventory. But how do we talk about looking at what is in the inventory that currently is not the LRA or the NOAA, but could be? So how do we look at incentives to take product from Class B or Class C types that could benefit from rental assistance or, landlord improvements and some funding sources if they would dedicate units to become part of the inventory that aren't currently part of the inventory today?
I think, let me cue you up on that one if we could, just because it was a discussion that we had when we were doing work for Pinellas County about how they would spend some of the penny money. So the Penny 4 program was allocated, a portion of that was allocated for affordable housing and for economic development. And the affordable housing discussions were mixed in terms of, driving that money for new product and driving that money to older properties to hold them as affordable. So that's one of the programmatic elements of that, was to take that local money and provide a gap for investment in existing property.
I think that's a route we've seen. Unfortunately, philanthropy plays a role in these situations. Like, how do you, particularly, we haven't looked closely at this, but I understand big investment groups are buying up lots of single-family homes and owning them and operating them as rental buildings, which takes a huge swath of units out of the normal market, and they act like Wall Street type investments. But we saw a philanthropic group buy up a lot of housing, single-family detached housing units on a proposed rail line in suburban Minneapolis to try to, because they knew the only way to really control the real estate is to own the real estate. And again, that was, the city can't do that, but that's the thing you can do. We've seen in Chicago in particular, where we have a huge supply of small buildings, a lot of 4, 6, 8, 10 unit apartment buildings that had trouble accessing loans for rehab. Sometimes the city plays a role, but there was a private nonprofit that basically leans on the local banks and their leverages their CRA requirements to produce some market loans for rehab and refinancing. Mom and dad want to move to Florida and the kids want to own the building. Then mom and dad need the money to go buy a house in Florida. Well, that's a financing vehicle to keep the property in the hands of a small owner rather than going into a big portfolio. So there are tools, and it's just all of them are difficult. It takes time and energy and money. And so again, in our toolkit pile, I think some of these are on the way in, are already there. But there's no easy way to do it, I guess. Maybe that's, again, not a very helpful comment. Sorry.
No, I think you just have to keep asking the question so that eventually, something does click and you find that solution. I was on the phone with Austin this week, and they just launched Affordable Austin, and they're giving incentives, but the developments must have 50% affordable housing units in order to obtain the incentives. So, and they're getting participants because their real estate is just so limited, similar to us, where we used to have a 3-month inventory. We're now down to, I think, a 1-month or even a 6-week inventory for people who are relocating to this area. So we definitely have those challenges. This has been great, and look forward to having you all come meet with us so that we can have some further discussions. Thank you.
Commissioner Kemp, thanks for your patience.
No, it's okay. I learned, obviously, some stuff there, but I did want to make sure I could see this again, because I really would like to absorb a little more of it. But, it just strikes me again that we're back at the, what is the public policy ability to do anything about this? And I guess I just heard a little bit about Austin, but it seems like the tools in the chest aren't really significant enough that I hear of to, the zoning and any of the other things we have just don't seem to really hit it. And I think I've been very concerned in the county, as was just mentioned. Big companies, two in particular, I guess, have they're going out, and they're big corporations, 10,000 single-family homes, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. They take them up immediately, pay more than, they're there. And I think it's I don't even know what to do about it. It's the free market. And I think it's a real threat to any affordability in the future for first-time homeowners or anything like that to get out there. They can't compete with these big corporations that are willing to go in and pay way above market and own it and own a lot of it. So I think it's just a big problem to piece out. And I don't see that I haven't heard what we can do at this point quite, because it just doesn't seem like the overlay or the zoning do it. I think we do have to look in the county at our affordable housing benefits we give, but in terms of infrastructure. But I think it's a big problem.
Yeah, the penny tax in Pinellas County, we've done a fair bit of work over there. So they have a dedicated local source of funds sufficient to subsidize, and close the gap on a handful of deals a year is I think what their plan is. But that's not nothing. You know what I mean? And
right. Well, is that how much a year does that come to? Because I think I read that they had $10 million a year, but that doesn't sound like it. Well, we have $10 million a year that we've dedicated in Hillsborough County, plus we keep adding to it. And, that's a drop in the bucket. So that's equal to their 10 million, and it's just like it's not doing, anything. And that's, it's de minimis in compared to the need.
It's a problem, I think, that's been created over generations. Also, Commissioner, I think that's the challenge. And so undoing it, we can't undo it in a single day. I think I guess it's a little bit of my own opinion, so you guys can take it for what it's worth. But, there's artificially low zoning heights in a lot of parts of the country, including Chicago, where I live, have squeezed out just undersupplied housing, basically, in the right locations by policy of municipalities. And so there's just, I live in the city, and I'm in a 2-story single-family house, and I'm, 4-6 blocks from a train station. Like, my house shouldn't exist, basically, but it does. So I live here, you know what I mean? So but undoing that, it's a 100-year-old house. Undoing that's going to take 100 years, or at least trying to solve it, and you got to just keep chiseling at it. I think you're right.
We had a question, Rich, with MPO had a question in the chat about how the developers that we've talked to so far, specifically the affordable housing developers, view TOD and view transit accessibility as they're thinking about project locations. And as I recall, Caitlin, accessibility to a decent bus service is part of what they look at. It's an important factor. But they also were mentioning that their tenants are still relatively car dependent, And so they see things, for example, like a parking reduction helping them to a certain extent, but they can't go too low because they're still serving an auto-dependent population. It may not be 2 per household, it may be 1 car per household, but they can't go super low on parking. But I should let Caitlin and Jeff talk more about that one, but that was a topic of discussion, that transit accessibility is important to them as they're looking at sites.
Yeah, I agree, Steve. We did hear that developers are excited about transit-oriented development. When you consider the largest spending categories for households, it is on their housing and on their transportations. So the extent that you can reduce some of the costs associated with owning a car and transition to other modes such as transit, that helps reduce those costs for households and increases affordability, enhances affordability overall for folks.
Jay had a comment in here about the sort of question about the way, and I think, Jay, I'm interpreting a little bit, but how bonuses how a bonus program plays out in different market environments. So as in a really hot market, there's a possibility in Austin, represents a particularly hot national market. But even in in Austin itself, I'm sure that's more and less attractive depending on how hot that market is in a specific neighborhood. So we have a really wide variety of market potential where we have locations where the rent levels are sufficiently low that we don't expect developers to be chasing a density bonus because they're not going to move. They're not likely to be able to support a structured park project, so they're going to hit the existing max density with a surface park product, and they don't need the incentive and they don't need the bonus. So regardless of how we plan for it, the market just may not be strong enough to make that bonus attractive. I'm trying to track. Jay's got his hand up. So Jay, you want to chime in?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. The follow-up to that is this goes back to what Jeff was talking about, that downtown may be the area that has the ability for the carrot and the stick. So Waters in Florida doesn't need help. If somebody wants to build an apartment building there, they may ask for help, but it's not an area where you would say that you need it on the carrot and the stick because the valuation isn't there. But what I'm wondering about, again, and this goes back to the idea of people living within their means and long-range planning, what are we supposed to do with that in mind if that is something that perpetuates? So we've seen traditionally from downtown to Tampa Heights to Seminole Heights as gentrification pushes its way north. So eventually it's going to go north of the river if it hasn't already, and we're going to see that same pattern of people staying there 10, 15, 20 years, going back to what Commissioner Overman was talking about. And then areas that today are considered affordable in 10, 15, 20 years aren't. But if we don't have the tools in place, we lost the ability to incentivize that development because the market will simply build there and not need the incentivization. So that's kind of that missing portion that I'm looking at. It's almost, and Jeff, you may say this, it's almost like Houdini. It's like what do you do when that's how do you spur things that you're spurring it out of thin air? Thanks.
Jeff, I won't be able to answer that one, obviously, but I'll talk for a minute and I'll let you put together some.
I got to work into Houdini here. Yeah. Jay's got me twisted around. I'm working on it.
So there's one of the questions is there are state tax benefits to those longtime homeowners that hold them in place longer than they need to. So they're not. You may not downsize because you may not want to walk away from that tax benefit that you've got in your existing property, even with portability. So we have, folks that moved into neighborhoods early at a good price are probably, there's a bit of an anchor, and they're less likely to downsize or less likely to open up that inventory. So we're kind of stuck with that at a local level. You all should be, maybe talking to folks in Tallahassee about that one. I was thinking on the other side, Jay, just from a supply standpoint, is that we still have we're still a community with not a wide range of housing types available for different households. We're a single family or an apartment complex kind of community. There's not a lot of missing middle available. So part of it is to try to figure out zoning programs and other strategies just to build the supply. So there's more opportunities for people to find the right kind of home, or, find the right nest as their households change over time. And there's not a lot of that opportunity available now. But that only you asked a really big, hairy question. That only nibbles around the edges of it.
Yeah, I guess I was, maybe I'm not even fully understanding the question. I think Jay was talking about sort of this tide of gentrification and increasing displacement, and if there's obviously public money or anything public in it, we got to make sure to do what we can to stop the tide, or at least mitigate the tide. That's I guess. So I think as long as we're not unwittingly contributing to it, or at least trying to exact or extract some protections in the course of it, that's my. We look at this yellow zone on the map here. That's the waves that come, and what do we do there? And the red is safe for now. So what do we do to lock down the safe for now, so that it doesn't become unsafe in the future? So those are, again, goes to what we're headed in terms of recommendations. There are different challenges with different solutions. It's going to be build new in the green because, as I think the Commissioner said, that ship has sailed. But these other places, there's a tide to hold back, and maybe it's housing diversification. To Steve's point, that those are challenges there. Obviously, allowing townhomes and higher density in those neighborhoods, that's going to create. Again, the problem is building new is expensive. So, like, every single thing that leads to new construction is like you're solving the problem at the beginning of the pipe, and the actual solutions at the end of the pipe. So it's fine building new affordable, restricted units, but there's so many units in here that are at risk of falling out. That's the real wide part of the supply. I guess that's a bit of a ramble. Sorry.
There are tools that we can consider. Community land banks are an important one to put older housing units in a land bank and to help preserve affordability in the long term. So there are tools that could be used.
We've got a couple more hands up. We can go maybe another 5, maybe 10 minutes, because I'll close out my slides really quickly. So Stephen, do you want to jump in? And then Commissioner.
Sure. Yeah. Could you go back to? Just a quick question. Could you go back to the slide that showed the percent of households at each income bracket that were cost burdened? Caitlin had a lot of really great points that I'm also trying to make sure I captured in my notes. I was just trying to understand this dynamic a little bit better. So is it reasonable to conclude that sort of a rising sea will lift all boats? Like, should we be focusing just as much on increasing housing period across the board as we are on the 60% and below AMI? Like, are they that interrelated? Like, are we missing that relationship there, that it just affects our entire inventory so much that it will affect the NOAA type housing, which will help absorb the affordability issue?
Caitlin, is that right if I jump in? I don't mean to step on your toes. I mean, I guess I think you got to do everything, unfortunately, because it's such a big problem. And so if we put new, in this case, new housing units at the top of the pipeline, again, to serve the 75,000 or more, maybe those folks move from their long-time home. They're tired of whatever, their old house, and they want a smaller, newer, nicer house. That might be part of the solution. So I think it's in the mix. Again, we tend to believe philosophically, I think, that the market is good at making things for wealthy people. So, like, the level of, you can maybe get out of the way with the zoning or something, but other than that, there's not much the public sector needs to do to make the market produce, top-of-the-line market rate housing. And where the real interventions can occur, or, obviously you can exact and do all those other things out in other bigger scale new construction projects. So I guess that maybe the short answer is a little bit of everywhere you can, you try to take a bite out of a big problem. It's going to take a lot of different bites.
Yeah, I agree. I think increasing the overall supply of housing is a good thing, but if it's a question of how do you direct limited public sector resources, targeting the lower income households would be priority, assuming that the market with the right zoning, et cetera, can increase the housing supply with a diverse supply of housing at various scales and intensities.
Commissioner Kent?
Thank you. And then,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
sorry, I'm sorry. I just have one more question. When you guys present the toolbox, are you also going to sort of provide some type of an indication of the anticipated impact of that recommendation? Because it seems like we have a lot of tools. It's just which ones are going to probably be the most effective at addressing our unique issues on this corridor, you know? So are you guys going to be able to give us a sense of that, or do we have to really kind of like test each one?
We were anticipating giving providing a sense of the total number of units that could be constructed or preserved or anything like that by each tool. We'll have indication of which ones are maybe more or less effective at closing the gap or not. For example, you know, we heard that the parking waivers and zoning aren't a huge financial incentive versus public land disposition. We can kind of provide order of magnitude level of incentive associated with those tools. Will primarily be higher level, thinking about what is the tool, is it currently being used, how could it more effectively be used to target priority areas along the corridor, and thinking about best practices.
Well, our financial modeling, Caitlin, is going to test some of these, working with Proservia, to get a real math on a couple of these ideas. So we won't have a math answer for everything, but we will definitely be able to say, is this a 5-cent solution, a $1 solution, or a $10 solution? That kind of thing we can say. Unfortunately, the $10 solution is $10. Like that's the solution, and everything else, I think, if I were to kind of give you a peek at the conclusions, it's cash, and these other things are all moving the margins, and they're fine and they're good, but at the end of the day, there's still a multi-million-dollar hole in every affordable deal, and they just need the money. You know what I mean?
Commissioner Kent?
Thank you. I just have a de minimis suggestion for the toolbox, and one that has disturbed me greatly in the last couple of years is seeing right near me, and I live right off this corridor, a major storage place has been built, and at least 3 have been built right near me on major transit routes where it could have been a multifamily affordable housing unit. And it makes me crazy, and it seems as though we have no barrier to that because of form-based zoning or overlay that we have. And so they meet the form of the affordable or the apartment buildings right next to them that are going up. But, it's to me like sacrilege practically that we have these storage units, 5 stories popping up, 4 stories popping up all over the place that could have easily accommodated a footprint for multifamily housing. So I'm just wondering about something in the city on these major transit routes, and before it gets more of them, to force those to be out in some place that's far out where people don't need, where people can go out and check them out every once a month or whatever.
And those projects use bonus too. Those at bonus density. We've done 12 bonus density agreements in the city in the past 5 years, and 4 of them were for self-storage.
That's
not
horrible.
One of them.
Every
not
time
one of them was for affordable housing. So, when you talk about the toolkit for the bonus density incentives, I hope that you will have some findings in relationship to that. We're looking at that right now. Sorry to jump in, but I know exactly where you're talking about, and I drive it every day.
Right.
And it's very hard to see that, but the market is what's dictating, and the incentives are not enough to beat the mighty dollar.
Except what if we said that they just storage can't be located here? I don't understand why we can't just do that. Storage can't be located in these corridors, and then someone else has to get it for something else.
Agreed. We need to be looking at that. And we are looking at the bonus, but even if if they didn't bonus, the use would have still been permissible, and we need to activate those corridors.
Can't we also do something, because we did form-based programming to allow the size building, so can't we extend that to say, well, it can't be used for storage, that would be a prohibited use on these important corridors where transit and housing makes all the sense in the world and this doesn't. That, along with the form-based, that there could be a further restriction on ever, using it for storage units. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of that I've seen that it should be prohibited, that is coming up. And we allowed that to come up through the form-based, overlay, which was put there a few years ago, and I just feel like they're using that. So, I don't understand why we can't just add that in to the form-based overlay and say no.
We can definitely look at changing the code to address that, for sure. The other, now that I'm talking, can I ask one last question?
Quickly, yeah, I want to do a quick backup.
A lot of the missing tools are the socioeconomic, the gentrification discussion. The affordable housing can look just like really good housing. Many of our projects are meeting very, very, very strong neighborhood opposition because they don't want that there. And that's a tool that we really need when we're looking at, and I know there's several companies out there, Gentrify, that'll, work with you to remarket and look at, introducing this, but nobody wants it in their neighborhood, then where do we put it? Because it can look and function just like market rate housing, and I could take pictures throughout the city of what you refer to as ELRA that looks just like a market rate house. But people, as soon as you say affordable housing, stick up their NIMBY window and don't want it there. So that's another one of the biggest challenges we face. We have great opportunities. We've had several projects come through, but those projects can't get that support.
Yeah, I think this is a good segue, if I could, to talking about workshops, because we expect to get more neighborhood voices into the discussion through the workshops we're planning for the end of next month, the end of May, and we'll be engaging in those kinds of debates, discussions, dialogues with folks, and expect to hear more about either concerns about changes in density intensity or concerns about affordable projects close to where folks live. So that's part of what we're gearing up for, is to guide those discussions, and possibly, and we can circle back with you about the possibility of showing some of those local examples to reinforce the notion that these are not incompatible with the neighborhood and probably would not be known if it wasn't advertised. We're planning for 2 virtual workshops. We're looking at doing specific outreach to neighborhood associations along the corridor to do briefings and presentations to those sessions, and we're starting to prepare a web survey. So the workshops that we have are scheduled for May 25th and May 26th, using a tool like a virtual workshop like this, because we're still reluctant to rely specifically on in-person meetings, but we do want to supplement that with some direct outreach to the neighborhood associations, and we've talked to the city about helping us support that effort. So it's a WebEx format sessions. We'll bring people up to speed on the project, and we'll focus discussion around some key questions about how the recommendations are coming together. So we're working with the city, county, planning commission, MPO, and other partners to get email blasts out about the project. They can go to the website and register to get their spot, tell us what they're interested in, so we can organize some breakout sessions around specific topics, and then we'll keep cranking out reminders as we get closer to the workshop. So look for those. You all are on the list of folks that will get emails within the next couple days announcing the dates, and you can register, but you can also forward those notes, and then we'll be following up with social media through various channels to try to get on folks' radar screen. So that was the quick report. We are essentially complete with the presentation here. I know we've kicked off a lot of discussions. We want to be able to continue this dialogue as we go forward. If you could, and I'm looking at some specific individuals like Abby, help us get to the right folks with the city to learn more about what you all are working on. That would be really helpful for us as we start to patch together our recommendations and start to think about how we stack those up in priorities. So we will present a whole range of things focused specifically on affordability, but we want to make sure we bring what we think is going to be most impactful to the top of that list, so we can make sure that the elected officials and others who have to stick by these decisions and possibly commit funds are getting the most impactful story first and the supportive recommendations second. So we're right about time. We're at 4:27 according to my clock. So we're going to wrap this up. We've got a couple minutes so we can open it up to discussion. I think, Michelle, if you're okay, Michelle, I'm just going to flip through a couple slides. We're still posting new information on the project website. So visit goharttod.org. You can access the material that we've already prepared, which is the context assessment, which has the affordable housing analysis attached to that, and then the summary document, which is a higher level introduction to the project overall. And then as we get closer to the workshop date, we'll open up the survey, we'll announce the upcoming meetings, and we'll continue to add additional information to the site as we move forward. So please, if you haven't checked that out, go ahead and check it out. We've had pretty good traffic to the site so far, and we're going to be pushing people here for additional information about where we're headed as we start to load up the material that we will be presenting at the workshop, and eventually our harder recommendations about what sort of actions we think the city and county should be taking. So you have the contact information. It'll be, it's here on the website. You can get a hold of us. We have all of our contact information is in the invitation to this meeting, so reach out to us at any time. We would love your help getting to neighborhood associations and community groups to let them know more about the project. If you have any questions or have information you want to share, please reach out. And we look forward to seeing you in our workshops later in May and in our discussions with the working group as we move through the project. Thank you all again for your time this afternoon.
Well, thank you all.
Thanks for attending. Thank you.
Thanks for using web.